You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Your wedding day. It's often described as one of the happiest days of a person's life. Very few walk into a marriage expecting it to end. And there are two countries in the world where it can't. The Philippines is one of them. For centuries, it has been illegal to divorce there. But that could change soon. I'm Teresa Tang. CNA Correspondent Nivell Rayda joins me today to explain why, and why some in the Southeast Asian nation say it's a bad idea. Hi, Nivell. Welcome back.
Hi, Teresa.
The idea of a fairy tale marriage, it's introduced to many of us when we're children, princesses, princes, they're happily ever afters. But real life is messy. And for some people, if things don't work out, you just have to lawyer up, you sign some papers, you move on, right? But that's not the case in the Philippines. What inspired this story and why is divorce prohibited there?
I was traveling to the Philippines mainly to do a story on migrant workers. But whenever I'm on a reporting trip, I always aim to do at least two stories. And that's when I came across the fact that the Philippines is the only country outside of the Vatican where divorce is illegal. And I was wondering why that is the case and how does this impact society. And what I discovered is that it was introduced by the Spanish, actually, the colonial rule. And when the Philippines was taken over by the United States, divorce was legalized for a very brief period of time. But then after the Philippines became independent, divorce is illegal again. It was basically not recognized under the country's civil code. Right now, couples can only separate but remain legally married. So even though the spouse is abusive, unfaithful, negligent, you can only legally separate. And that has a lot of ramification. Like, for example, even though if you separate, the deeds, the title, everything is still under you and your husband's name. So you can't, for example, buy a property. You need to have your husband's signature. If you want to open a business, you need a husband's signature as well, because technically speaking, you're still legally married. You can also file for an annulment, but here's the catch. You have to prove that the marriage, which happened years and years ago, decades and decades ago, was not lawful to begin with.
Oh, that's tough.
And all that abuse, neglect, which came after the union are not grounds for annulment. So you can't seek an annulment even though you're being abused, you're being tortured by your spouse.
Then what's public sentiment around divorce? Are people generally accepting of the law, or has there been pressure to change it? Because I know the Filipino family, the institution of the family, it forms the foundation of society, so much so that the notion is enshrined in the Constitution. So I imagine any law that would facilitate the breakup of a family would be controversial there.
Yes, you're right. Like right now, it's about an even 50-50 split and leaning in favor of divorce because more and more people are open to the idea, especially given the fact that the Philippines is the only country outside of the Vatican where divorce is illegal. So everyone else are now thinking, hey, even our own former colonizer, Spain, has legalized divorce. All the other countries like Mexico, Brazil has legalized divorce. You're right, it is still a very, very sensitive topic. So there is a fierce debate between both camps, both the proponents and also the critics of legalizing divorce. This is understandable because this is something which has been around for generations. You can imagine the debate that is going on.
For me, preparing for this episode with you, the hardest part was watching all this raw footage, the interviews that you held. You sent me the tapes and I watched them. I was pretty emotional for some of that because there were these women who shared intimate details of their lives, why they wanted a divorce, and they were mostly stories that involved abuse. How did you find these women? And for you, when you heard it firsthand, how did you feel?
Well, we had a lot of help from Divorce Filipinas, which is a coalition of different groups of women and men who are all advocating for the legalization of divorce. We interviewed 4 women in total with the help of the coalition. However, there's this one woman which we kind of like stumbled across by accident as we're doing a totally separate story on migrant workers. She was a former migrant worker, and she explained the reason why she went abroad was because she was abused and she was trying to escape her abusive husband. These women are so amazing, and the stories they tell, they're just heartbreaking. I met this one woman, her name is Cheryl Estoya. So she got married when she was really young, at 17, and she was forced to marry the man she does not love and does not love her back. Her husband was always drunk. He spent all the family's money on gambling, and he even tried to force their eldest child to quit school and work. And that's the straw that broke the camel's back, I guess. She finally had the courage to say, enough is enough. And she has been fighting for 12 years to get her marriage annulled. She has spent in total maybe equivalent to 30,000 US dollars. And even after she has exhausted all her savings, going through all that trouble, her motion was denied by the court. Because it is hard. It is hard to prove a marriage that happened 30 years ago was not legal in the first place. And you can imagine that she had to travel for 5 hours from her village to the city where the courthouse is, and whenever she needs to appear in court. Now, she can still appeal, but she doesn't want to go through that again, and hinges all her hope now that divorce will finally be legalized in the Philippines, because the legal process has been hard on her and also her children, not only financially, but also emotionally. And here's my interview with Madam Estoya.
Isa sa mga anak ko, nagtestigo doon sa korte kasi hiningi ng judge.
My children were asked to testify against their father in court, and it was really hard for them. I cannot let them go through that again. The law here in the Philippines sometimes treats you like a criminal, even when you are the one being abused. Even criminals are given parole and being released. What about us?
That law that prohibits divorce, it's been in place for centuries, for generations, except for a short time, as you mentioned off the top. But in May of this year, something happened that has never happened before. The country's House of Representatives approved the Absolute Divorce Act. It passed it on to the Senate for more deliberation. And that's big, right? This hasn't happened before. So what got us to this point? Why are we seeing such progress now?
Well, it is an unprecedented success. They have never reached this point before, especially for this bill to be deliberated by the Senate the way it is today. But that success didn't come overnight. They started to get the ball rolling around 12 years ago through the help of this congressman. His name is Mr. Edsel Lagman. He's the one who's willing to fight for this. He's the one who's drafting the bill. He's the one lobbying his peers and convince them that this is the way forward as a nation. So at first, Mr. Lagman was unsuccessful, but that didn't deter him. Even if it meant that all that effort was for nothing and he have to start from scratch again and again, introducing the bill, writing letters to the chairman of the House of Representatives, and then presenting the bill, and then the lower house have to vote for it, convincing the Senate. He has to do this over and over and over again. And now, fast forward 12 years later, there are now at least 5 of the 24 members of the Senate who have spoken out in support of the bill. And maybe he's hoping there are a few more who secretly supporting this bill but doesn't want to go public about it. But at the grassroots level, we started seeing like all these informal groups. Some of them started as nothing more than Facebook groups, basically, where women can have discussions. And they start to get together and form a coalition. Together, they have done various campaigns, educating the public, both online and off, spreading their message, get people on board. And the coalition has vowed, like, whatever happens to this bill, whether it's truly passed into law or not, they will keep fighting. And here's my interview with one of the members of the coalition, Madam Stella Sebonga.
Still hoping po na makapasa talaga kasi hindi lang naman.
We're still hoping that the bill will be passed. It's not only for us, but for the future of our children, because we don't know what the future holds, like those who were abandoned and abused. Sometimes others resort to killing because there is no divorce or annulment. That's why our group lobbies for the bill to be passed.
Many female Filipinos, they work overseas as domestic workers. And I wonder if that's been a factor in terms of disrupting domestic family dynamics because often the wife, the mother, isn't home.
To an extent, it has. There are cases of migrant workers falling in love with a co-worker abroad or their manager or their employer, even though they have families waiting at home. And the same goes to those who were left behind at home. Sometimes they fall in love with a neighbor or someone else because the wives or the husband is far away in another country. And that goes for both men and women. But conversely, there are people who also went abroad, like the woman that I interviewed, Jessica, not her real name, to get away from their abusive husbands or their toxic marriage in the Philippines.
We've heard of so-called Las Vegas weddings. People make a few bad decisions. Before you know it, they're at the altar. And quick unions often lead to quick separations. This proposed bill that you're talking about, Nivell, it has strict parameters, though. It's not saying that divorce is to be taken lightly.
So the way the bill is now, there are grounds for divorce. So you cannot divorce simply because you don't love someone anymore. There are strict grounds to follow. So for example, you can file for a divorce if you have been abused or your children has been abused by one of the spouses. You can file for a divorce if your spouse is cheating on you, or also on grounds like they can no longer provide for the family because he's now serving a very long time in prison or something, or he has met someone else and no one knows where he is right now. So there are grounds like that. And there's also like a period which has yet to be determined where a recently divorced couple would have to wait before they can remarry. So there are very, very strict grounds.
The Philippines, of course, has a predominantly Catholic population. Religious beliefs are deeply rooted in Filipino society. So how does that play into it? How does faith play into this?
Faith has been a very huge factor. The church views divorce as a sin. And not just the Catholic Church, but also the Protestant churches as well. And they have been very vocal about this. And they have been actively spreading their message via sermons, preaches to their congregation. There's this one church which is the most prominent church in the Philippines, the Quiapo Church in Manila. And people flock to this church every day. And the church exteriors has these giant banners which reads, "No to divorce," and "What God has united, no man can separate," something like that. And the church, they want divorce to remain illegal. And they want to play a bigger role in reconciling couples in troubled marriages. And here's my interview with Father Jerome Sosilano of the Catholic Bishop Conference of the Philippines.
You did not treat violence in divorce. You just simply make them all separate. And now you allow this violent guy to marry again another woman. And that woman is going to turn into a punching bag later on. You did not treat the problematic spouse. If there are problematic unions, why shouldn't we, the church, intervene so that we can help these couples survive the difficulties that they experience in their married life?
Well, it's no surprise then that advocates who are pushing for change, they have targets on their backs. Your report talks about how supporters of the bill have received not only criticism, but threats as well. What are they afraid of? What do they think will happen to society if this bill is passed?
Well, they fear that legalizing divorce will, first of all, threaten the sanctity of marriage. Legalizing divorce, they believe, will invoke God's wrath, or it will open a floodgate so wide that everyone suddenly, out of the blue, wants a divorce right away. And they also fear that it will enable gold diggers. There will be many who get married again and again, seeking alimonies and separation of assets and stuff like that. And you're right, these activists have been bombarded with hateful comments online. But also in real life, it is hard for them, for example, to attend high school reunions or family gatherings because there will always be friends, family members, even parents, mothers and fathers who would tell them, "Stop what you're doing. The Philippines will never legalize divorce. Stop what you're doing right now."
Is there a plan B? For example, can existing laws be amended instead to help those that are trapped in bad marriages? Do we need this new bill, or can things kind of move forward but just changed?
Well, that is something that the critics has been proposing, a middle ground. Right now, the only solution to a troubled marriage are legal separation and annulment. And a separation means you're still married, and annulment, you have to prove that a marriage is unlawful to begin with. So the grounds for annulment are very limited, such as you found out that your spouse is already married to someone else at the time of your wedding, or another ground is that you found out later that you are actually cousins, like for example. So, those are the grounds for an annulment. Those are the only grounds for an annulment. And the critics say, like, okay, why not expand the grounds of an annulment to include things like abuse or abandonment or infidelity? For some critics, just don't call it divorce. We just we can call it annulment plus or something. And so some activists are okay with this middle ground as long as we can end our marriage. We can call it whatever. But some are steadfast. We want divorce, and for it to be called as divorce.
Let's look at the calendar then. This bill, it still has to be debated, has to be passed in the Senate before it becomes law. What timeline are we looking at here? How likely do you think it'll go through?
The current House of Representatives ends their term in 2025. So the bill has to be passed before that. Otherwise, they have to start from scratch again. They have to draft the bill again. They have to present it. They have to write letters. They have to have open hearings. They have to vote on it, start from scratch all over again. But everyone I talk to seems to think that there is a good chance the bill will be passed into law, because more and more Filipinos, including some of the senators, some of the politicians, are open to the idea, including Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. and his wife, who somewhat supports the idea but aren't willing to say that publicly. But several organizations could still bring the case to the Supreme Court and challenge the constitutionality should it pass the Senate and becomes law. They have, in fact, vowed to bring the case to the Supreme Court, and I quote, "not even before the ink is dry on the new law."
Oh, wow. It sounds like they're so close, but still so far. It's such a divisive issue, one that has passionate advocates on both sides, clearly. And it's going to be so interesting to see what Congress decides. Thank you so much for this, Nivell.
Thanks for having me, Teresa.
And a reminder that the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. And you can find Nivell's reports on YouTube as well as on cna.asia anytime. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, and me, Teresa Tang. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.